Eleanor Marsh, Duchess of Rowanbury, stood in the doorway of the small parlour at Marlow Chase, and did not go in. She did not cry out. She did not reach for the doorframe to steady herself. She did not ask the housekeeper, who stood frozen at her elbow with a tray of lemon water, to repeat what had just carried through the half-open door on her husband's own voice. She set the little enamel box she had been carrying, the one holding the quarter's household accounts, reconciled to the farthing the night before, down on the hall table with both hands, gently, the way a woman sets down something she does not wish to break by accident. Then she turned her mother's plain silver ring once around her finger, and stopped. Inside the parlour, Julian Ashford, 9th Duke of Rowanbury, was saying to his aunt, in the unhurried tone he used for weather and crop yields, "She is suitable. That is all a wife need be." And beside him, arranged on the good settee like a piece of furniture recently delivered, sat Lady Sophia Vane, laughing at something that had not yet been said, her hand resting on the arm the Duke had not offered his own wife in 11 months. By the following spring, half the county would know Eleanor Marsh's name, the way they knew the assize calendar and the price of wool, as a fact that governed the year. The Duke of Rowanbury would spend that same spring learning, slowly and at cost, the difference between a woman who is useful and a woman who is loved, and discovering that he had been given the choice between them only once, and had already spent it wrong. But that was still ahead of her, in the doorway, on an ordinary Tuesday, in the June of 1822. The summer had come to Rowanbury the way it always did, heavy and indifferent, thickening the hedgerows and slowing the river below Marlow Chase to something the colour of strong tea. Eleanor had married into that river 2 years before, in the cold February after her father's death had left behind a small estate called Larkspur Hollow, a stack of honest but insufficient ledgers, and a debt to the Ashford family that no one had troubled to explain to her fully until the settlements were already signed. She had understood, by the second week of her marriage, that she had been acquired rather than chosen, not unkindly, not cruelly, but the way a man acquires a competent housekeeper or a reliable horse. She had also understood, within the same fortnight, that the estate accounts had not been properly kept in 4 years, that the tenant leases on the eastern farms were bleeding money through an arrangement no one had thought to question, and that she was, in point of fact, extremely good at fixing exactly these kinds of problems. She had spent 2 years being extremely good at it. She had not once been thanked for it in a way that suggested anyone had noticed the woman doing the work rather than the work itself. Her mother, dead 9 years now, had left her exactly one repeated sentence, worn smooth from handling. A thing well kept is not the same as a thing well loved. Eleanor had understood it as a caution about houses. She was beginning, in the doorway of the parlour, to understand it as a description of herself. She did not go in. She turned instead and walked the length of the east corridor, out through the garden door, and into the walled kitchen garden, where the beans were coming on, and no one but Tam Coyle's boy, weeding the far row, could see her face. She permitted herself 10 minutes. She had permitted herself exactly 10 minutes for every hard thing since she was 16 years old, ever since her mother had died in one of them, and Eleanor had learned that grief, uncounted, would eat a person's whole life if you let it sit at the table. 10 minutes, and then the ledger, or the letter, or the visit that needed making. She stood among the beanpoles and let the 10 minutes have her. Let her hands shake. Let her breath come short. Let the sentence "she is suitable," that is all a wife need, be turned over and over like a stone in a mill. And then she took out her father's old pocket watch, looked at it, and put it away. The blow, when it came in full, came 3 days later, in front of 40 guests. Marlow Chase held its Midsummer Garden gathering every year without fail, an event so fixed in the county's calendar that Eleanor had spent the previous week arranging trestle tables, confirming the fish would arrive fresh from Rowan Water, and settling a dispute between the cook and the confectioner over who commanded the icehouse. She had done all of this, as she did most things at Marlow Chase, without any expectation of being seen doing it. She had learned to take her satisfaction from the doing rather than the noticing. She was crossing the lower lawn with a tray of correspondence for the Duke's signature, a landlord's habit she had fallen into simply because someone needed to, and no one else had, when she saw Julian come down the terrace steps with Lady Sir Sophia Vane on his arm, in full view of the assembled guests, and present her to his aunt, to the vicar's wife, to the visiting magistrate, as though introducing a discovery rather than confessing a habit. She did not stop walking. That was the first thing she made herself do, and the hardest. She heard it anyway, the particular hush that moves through a garden party, the way a change in weather moves through a field, guests going quiet and then too loud, too fast, covering the quiet with talk of nothing. She heard her husband's aunt, Lady Marguerite Fell, murmur something sharp behind her fan. She heard, worst of all, her own name spoken by a woman 2 feet away, who had not troubled to lower her voice. Well, one does wonder what the Duchess makes of it, followed by a soft, unbothered laugh, as though the Duchess were a piece of scenery that could not, by definition, make anything of anything. Eleanor set the tray down on the nearest table. She did it the way she had set down the accounts box 3 days before. Both hands, no sound, no haste. She did not confront him on the lawn. She did not weep into her handkerchief where the county could watch her do it. She walked, instead, the whole visible length of that lawn, past the trestle tables and the ice sculptures and the 40 pairs of eyes, doing their very best not to stare, climbed the terrace steps alone, and went into the house. She permitted herself 10 minutes in the small sitting room upstairs that had been her mother's dressing room once, in another life, before it became a room where a duchess sometimes sat and did sums. She sat with her hands folded and let the shaking happen, and when the 10 minutes were finished, she stood and made an inventory out loud. To no one, the way she had learned to do when the world had tried to take everything from her before, and she had needed to be told, in her own voice, what was actually still hers. Larkspur Hollow, her father's small freehold, entailed to no one, held in her name alone, under the terms of her mother's marriage settlement. Hers. 4 years of estate accounts she had rebuilt from ruin, with her own hand, every figure defensible, every entry witnessed. Hers, in the sense that mattered, whatever the deed said. Her needlework income, modest but entirely her own, banked quietly at the county bank under her maiden initials since the year she turned 19. Hers, her name, whatever anyone on that lawn believed it currently meant, still obstinately hers. I am not going to break, she said to the empty room, and found that saying it aloud made it slightly more true than it had been a moment before. I am going to work. She sent for her aunt that same evening. Prudence Marsh arrived from Larkspur Hollow 2 days later, in a farm cart she refused to trade for anything grander, wearing a bonnet that had seen at least one prior decade of service, and took one look at her niece's composed face across the good parlour, and said, "You've had a blow." "I have had an education," Eleanor said. "Same thing, generally, if you're paying attention." Prudence set down her basket. She had brought early plums, because Prudence Marsh did not believe in arriving anywhere with empty hands, and studied her niece the way she studied a fence line, for the place where the rot had started. What are you going to do about it? I am going to make myself impossible to overlook, Eleanor said. I have been very good at my work for 2 years, Aunt Prudence, and no one at Marlow Chase has the smallest idea of it. That was my error. I intend to correct it. Prudence's mouth did something that was not quite a smile, because Prudence Marsh did not smile easily, but it was close enough to count as approval. Well, she said, eat your plum first. A person thinks better with fruit in her. Eleanor ate the plum. It was, she noted with the flat clarity of a woman cataloguing evidence, extremely good. The Eastern farms had been losing money for 11 years, a fact Eleanor had suspected for one, and confirmed, with the aid of 4 ledgers, a survey map borrowed from the county office, and 3 long afternoons with the estate steward's assistant in the 8 days following the garden party. The problem, once she laid it flat on the study table, with her own careful hand beneath it, was almost embarrassingly simple. Old drainage arrangements dating from the last Duke's time diverted water off the high fields onto tenant land that had never been properly ditched to receive it, drowning 2 farms' worth of good soil every wet spring and costing the estate, by Eleanor's calculation, something close to £140 a year in reduced rents, forgiven arrears, and outright abandoned holdings. No one had fixed it, because fixing it required admitting that the arrangement, made 40 years earlier by a duke everyone still spoke of with reverence, had simply been wrong. Eleanor did not care whose arrangement it had been. She went to Tam Coyle first, because Tam Coyle held the worst drowned of the 2 farms, and had every reason to distrust another Ashford promise. He was a broad, sun-creased man of perhaps 40, who met her at his gate with his hat in both hands, and his jaw set for disappointment. "Your Grace," he said, in the flat tone of a man who has said your grace to landlords before, and watched it come to nothing. "Mr. Coyle." "I've brought the survey," Eleanor said, and unrolled it on the top rail of his own gate rather than asking to be shown indoors, because she had learned that men like Tam Coyle trusted business done where they could see all of it. "Your low-field floods, because the Marlow drain empties above your boundary instead of below it. It has done that since your grandfather's time. It is not your soil that is poor, it is the water that was never meant to come to you in the first place." Tam Coyle looked at the survey for a long moment. He looked at her. "And you mean to fix a 40-year ditch?" he said. "I mean to move it 80 yards east, at the estate's cost, before the autumn rains," Eleanor said. "I have already spoken to the mason about the culvert stone. I have not yet spoken to you, because I wanted you to see the figures before you believed a word I said." He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat. "My father asked for that same fix," he said finally. 19 years back, old Duke told him a farmer didn't need to be teaching a duke his own land. "Your father was correct," Eleanor said. "I am sorry it took 19 years and a different duchess for anyone to say so." Something in Tam Coyle's face loosened, not into a smile, but into something adjacent to it, the particular relief of a man who has spent 2 decades being told he was wrong about his own flooding field. "Well," he said, "move your ditch then, your grace. I'll bring my own boys to the digging, if the estate's paying stone." "The estate is paying stone," Eleanor said, and held out her hand, which surprised him enough that he shook it before he thought better of it, a duchess's bare hand in a tenant farmer's rough one, and word of that handshake was around the parish by Sunday. The ditch was moved in 11 days. The 2 farms did not flood that autumn, nor the autumn after. It was a small thing, in the scale of an estate worth many thousands a year. It was also, Eleanor understood with the flat satisfaction of a woman who has learned to measure her victories honestly, the first thing at Marlow Chase in 2 years that had her name attached to it in the mouths of people who were not required to be kind to her. She heard, some weeks later and second-hand, that a name had begun attaching itself to the Eastern Farms recovery that was not the steward's. She heard it from her husband's own valet, who mentioned it to the housekeeper, who mentioned it carefully to Eleanor, the way one passes along something that might matter to a person who has learned not to expect good news. Julian Ashford noticed his wife for the first time, really noticed her, the way one notices a fact rather than a fixture, on a wet Tuesday in late July, when his land agent brought him the quarter's rent returns, and he saw for the first time in the estate's recent history that the Eastern Farms had paid in full. Whose doing was the drain? He asked, and the agent, a careful man who did not enjoy being the one to answer, said, "Her Grace's, sir." Julian said nothing to that for a long moment. It was not precisely the moment he began to change. It was the moment the possibility of changing first became visible to him, the way a man notices, quite suddenly, that a door he had assumed was a wall has a handle. He did not go to her that night. He was not yet a man capable of that particular honesty. But he stood at his study window and watched the lamp burning in the small sitting room across the courtyard, where his wife sat most evenings now with her ledgers, and found that he did not look away from it as quickly as he had grown accustomed to doing. He had been raised, from the age of 9, to distrust exactly that kind of noticing. His father, the 8th Duke, had married for love, had married a woman named Isabel, who was by every surviving account brilliant and restless and entirely unsuited to the slow arithmetic of an estate, and had watched that marriage burn through the family's credit and, eventually, itself. In the space of 11 years, ending in a scandal so complete that Isabel Ashford had left England altogether and never once written to the son she had abandoned. The old Duke had spent the remainder of his life teaching that son one doctrine, repeated so often it had worn a groove. A man does not marry what he wants. He marries what will hold. Julian had been 19 when his father died, still believing it. He was 31 now, and had built his entire adult character on top of it, the way a man builds a house on a single load-bearing wall, never troubling to ask whether the wall was sound. He had chosen Eleanor Marsh 2 years before, precisely because he had believed her safe from that particular danger. A sensible woman of sensible family, a marriage of accounts and utility, nothing that could ever again cost him what his father's choice had cost. He had told himself, and occasionally told others, that this was a kindness to her as much as a caution to himself. He had not once considered that a woman might wish to be wanted, rather than merely deemed suitable, because he had trained himself, for 2 decades, not to consider wanting anything at all. He watched her lamp burn until well past midnight, and told himself it meant nothing, and knew, in the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes, that it was beginning to mean something after all. Meanwhile, in the estate office at the edge of the home farm, Rupert Colling, the Duke's second cousin and, since the old steward's retirement, the man who managed the family's outlying leases, sat with a document he had been composing, in careful stages, for the better part of a year. Colling stood next in line for the dukedom, after Julian's own unborn children, a fact that had mattered a great deal to him for most of his life, and had begun, in recent years, to matter more than was entirely wise. He had watched Julian's marriage settle into its cold, useful arrangement with something close to satisfaction. A childless, loveless marriage suited his prospects rather well, and had watched, with rather less satisfaction, the Eastern Farms turn a profit under a duchess whose competence he had previously discounted entirely. The note he had drawn represented an old debt, a genuine one once, from Eleanor's father's estate to the Ashford family, incurred in a bad harvest year, and long since folded into the marriage settlement and settled in full. Colling's note claimed it had never been settled at all, and claimed further, through a signature copied with real skill from an old lease document, that Eleanor's father had pledged Larkspur Hollow itself against it. If the note held, Larkspur Hollow, the one thing in the world that was unambiguously, entirely Eleanor's own, would pass to the Ashford estate, and through certain arrangements Colling had quietly made with a debt-collecting solicitor in the county town, a substantial portion of it would pass, in turn, to him. He needed only the right moment to produce it. A scandal would help. A marriage already unsteady would help more. He had been the one, in fact, who first suggested to Lady Sophia Vane that the Duke of Rowanbury might be amenable to a closer acquaintance, and had done so with a delicacy that left her uncertain, afterward, whose idea it had truly been. Sophia Vane was 24, handsome and in debt through a brother who gambled and a father who pretended not to notice. Colling had settled a portion of that debt, quietly, the previous winter, and had mentioned with equal quietness that he would consider the matter closed if she made herself visible on the Duke's arm at Marlow Chase's midsummer gathering, and continued to do so as opportunity allowed. She had told herself it was harmless, attention, nothing more, a Duke too cold to notice or care what was said of him, and had discovered, watching Eleanor Marsh cross that lawn without breaking stride, that harmless was not the word for what she had done. She did not yet have the courage to say so aloud. That would come later, and cost her something to say. By August, the county had begun to speak of the Duchess of Rowanbury the way it spoke of a well-built bridge, with the particular respect reserved for things that simply worked. Eleanor had turned the wool contract that same month, negotiating directly with the Rowan water merchants after discovering the estate's previous agent had been taking a private commission on every bale sold below market rate for 6 years running. She did not accuse the agent publicly. She simply renegotiated the contract herself, in the merchant's own counting house. With figures so precisely assembled that the merchant remarked, afterward, that he had not been managed so thoroughly since his own father died. The gain to the estate that quarter was upward of £200. The gain to Eleanor's reputation in the county was, by any honest measure, considerably larger. Julian found her in the study one evening in early September, bent over the wool ledger by candlelight, and did something he had not done in the 2 years of their marriage. He sat down across from her, uninvited, and asked what she was doing. Reconciling the merchant's figures against the estates, she said, without looking up. You needn't concern yourself with it. I have it in hand. I know you have it in hand, Julian said. I should like to understand it regardless. She looked up at that. It was, she thought, the first full sentence he had spoken to her in months that was not about weather, guests, or the disposition of a room. She explained the wool contract to him for perhaps 20 minutes, plainly, without softening the figures or her own opinion of the previous agent's honesty, and Julian listened the whole time without once interrupting, watching her hands move across the columns with something that was, if she had permitted herself to name it, very close to respect. You have done all this, he said finally, and I did not know it. You did not ask, Eleanor said. It was not an accusation. It was, in the manner she had learned from her mother's own maxims, simply a fact laid flat on the table between them. I have found that people rarely notice work that is never allowed to fail. He absorbed that in silence for a moment. I called you suitable, he said, at the midsummer gathering. To my aunt. Something in her stilled, the way water stills before it either freezes or breaks. "I heard you," she said. He did not offer an excuse. That, at least, she would credit him for later, though not yet, not that night. "I was wrong," he said. "I do not yet entirely understand how, but I am not fool enough to think a woman who has done what you have done this summer is merely suitable. No," Eleanor said. "I am not. I have never been merely anything, Julian. You simply were not looking." He did not answer that. He looked, instead, at her hands on the ledger, at the plain silver ring she wore that was not a duchess's ring at all, and something behind his eyes moved, the way weather moves behind a hill before it is visible over it. He rose to leave her to her work. At the door he stopped. "The ring," he said. "You never wear the Ashford sapphire. I offered it to you the week we married." "You offered it to me the way one offers an inventory item," Eleanor said. "I preferred my mother's ring. It was given for a reason. Yours was given for an arrangement." She looked at him then, steady, unhurried. "If you ever wish me to wear it, Julian, you will have to give it to me again. Properly, this time, not tonight, not with an excuse attached to it. Show me first." He left without answering. She heard him stop, once in the corridor, and then go on. 2 weeks later, Lady Sophia Vane came to Marlow Chase uninvited, on a grey afternoon threatening rain, and asked to see the Duchess alone. Eleanor received her in the small sitting room, poured tea for a woman she had every reason to despise, and waited. "I have not come to apologise," Sophia said, which was, Eleanor thought, at least an honest opening. "I do not know that I have the right to, yet I have come because I find I cannot continue as I have been, and I thought you deserved to hear why from me rather than from gossip." "Go on," Eleanor said. Sophia's hands were not steady around her cup. "Mr. Colling paid a debt of my brother's," she said. "Last winter. He asked, in return, that I make myself visible with the Duke. I told myself it cost nothing. I did not ask myself why a land agent should care so much for his cousin's marriage that he would spend his own money to unsettle it." She set the cup down. "I think now that it was never about the Duke at all. I think it was about you, your Grace, and something Mr. Colling means to take from you." Eleanor did not move, though something in her chest went very quiet and very cold. "What is he holding?" "A note," Sophia said, "against your father's old debt. I have seen it twice, on his desk, though I do not know all its particulars. I know it names Larkspur Hollow." The rain began outside, soft against the glass. Eleanor sat with that information for a long moment, turning it the way she turned every hard fact until it had a shape she could use. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me before it was demanded of you in a room full of people." "I do not expect your forgiveness," Sophia said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "Not tonight. But I find I am not interested in ruining a woman who was used as badly as I was, by the same hand, in a different currency. Go home, Lady Sophia. Say nothing to Mr. Colling of this conversation, and when the time comes, if it comes, tell the truth in front of whoever asks it of you." Sophia looked at her with something close to disbelief. "Why would you help me?" "I am not helping you," Eleanor said. "I am building something. You happen, at present, to be one of its stones." She rose, signalling the visit's end. "Whether you are a well-placed one is entirely up to you." That night Eleanor sat with her aunt and Mr. Aldous Finch, the county solicitor who had handled her father's affairs for 30 years, and knew every debt the Marsh family had ever honestly owed, and laid the problem out flat. "My father settled every obligation to the Ashford estate before he died," she said. "I have the receipted accounts in my own strongbox at Larkspur Hollow. If Mr. Colling produces a note claiming otherwise, it is either an error 4 years too late to matter, or it is a forgery. Finch, a small, precise man who wore his spectacles low and trusted nothing he had not examined twice, took the receipted accounts from her when she brought them the following morning, and spent 3 days comparing every signature against known specimens of her father's hand from the parish register, the bank, and 2 surviving letters. "It is not your father's signature," he said at last, laying both documents side by side on his desk with the flat satisfaction of a man who has proven a fact rather than merely believed one. "The letter formation is close, very close. But your father crossed his 7s in the continental fashion, always, in every document I have ever seen him sign, and whoever made this did not know to do it. It is a fine forgery, Your Grace. It is still a forgery. Can you swear to that in a magistrate's hearing?" "I can," Finch said, "and I will." Colling's counterpunch came a week later in the form of a sworn statement procured from a debt-collecting solicitor in the county town, attesting that the Marsh family's obligation had indeed never been formally discharged. A statement built. Eleanor understood at once, on the same forged note, laundered through a second signature to look independent. It was clever. It was also, she thought, the act of a man who had begun to feel the ground shift beneath him and was reaching for anything solid. She received the news of it from Finch with her hands perfectly steady around her own teacup. "He means to bring it before the quarter sessions," Finch said. "Publicly, he will claim Larkspur Hollow as forfeit. Then we will meet him at the quarter sessions," Eleanor said. Publicly, the Rowanbury quarter sessions were held that October in the Assembly Hall above the county courts, before the sitting magistrate and whatever portion of the parish cared to crowd the gallery, and by the appointed morning that portion was considerable. Word had travelled, in the way word always travelled through a county that fed itself on exactly this kind of reckoning, that the Duke's own cousin meant to strip the Duchess of her father's land, and half of Rowanbury had come to watch. Rupert Colling presented his case first, composed and unhurried, laying the note before the magistrate with the confidence of a man who has never once been made to answer for his own paper. Julian sat in the gallery beside his aunt, his jaw set, his hands very still in his lap. He had learned, by then, enough of his wife's own discipline to borrow it when he needed it most. Eleanor rose when it was her turn, and did not raise her voice. "I do not dispute that my father owed the sum named," she said. "I dispute that it remains owed, and I dispute entirely that he ever pledged Larkspur Hollow against it." She laid the receipted accounts before the magistrate. "Mr. Finch, who has served this county for 30 years, will confirm the hand and the seal." Finch confirmed both, precisely, without embellishment. "Mr. Colling's note," Eleanor continued, "bears my father's signature with every 7 crossed in the English fashion. My father never once, in 21 years of documents that survive him, crossed a 7 in his life. He learned his hand from a Genevan tutor and kept it to his death." She turned to the magistrate. "I would ask that the note be examined beside the receipted accounts, side by side, in this room, by anyone who cares to look." The magistrate did look, at length, and so did a great many others in the gallery who pressed forward to see for themselves, and the murmur that moved through the hall was the particular sound of a room recalibrating in real time. It was into that murmur that Tam Coyle rose, uninvited, from the gallery, hat in hand. "Might I speak, your worship?" The magistrate, startled but curious, allowed it. "I've farmed Ashford land 19 years, Tam said. Her Grace fixed a drain my own father begged for and never got. I've no stake in her ledgers nor her land, but I know a woman who deals plain when I see one, and I know Mr. Collingsman tried twice this summer to buy my silence on a boundary dispute, with coin that wasn't rightly his to spend. I'll swear to that, if it's wanted. It was wanted. So, in the space of the next quarter hour, was the merchant from Rowan Water, who confirmed that Colling had approached him privately in August, offering to smooth the wool contract dispute in exchange for a quiet word against the Duchess's management, should it ever be required. So, finally, was Lady Sophia Vane, who rose from the back of the gallery with her chin high and her hands, for once entirely steady. I was paid to make myself visible with the Duke, she said, into a hall gone very quiet indeed by Mr. Colling, to distract from exactly this note. I have seen the note itself, on his desk, before it was ever produced here. I am not proud of what I did. I am done doing it. Something behind Rupert Colling's composure went out, all at once like a lamp starved of oil. He did not confess. He did not need to. The room had already turned, audibly, entirely, the way a tide turns, not gradually, but altogether, once the moment arrives. The magistrate ruled the note forged, the claim void, and referred the matter of fraud to the assizes. Eleanor, when asked whether she wished Mr. Colling prosecuted to the fullest extent the law allowed, was silent a moment, and then spoke plainly enough that it carried to the back of the hall. "I do not wish him ruined," she said. "I wish him gone from this county's management of anything, and I wish every penny he extracted from Lady Sophia's family returned to her, from his own pocket, within the 12-month. If he does that, I will not press the matter further. If he does not, Mr. Finch has my authority to press it for me." It cost Colling everything he had actually wanted, the steward's post, the standing, the quiet claim on a dukedom he would now never be trusted near, and it cost him none of the thing Eleanor could have taken, and did not. The gallery understood the difference. It was, several of them said afterward, the single fact that turned Eleanor Marsh from a duchess the county respected into one it would have followed into a burning building. Julian did not speak to her on the ride home. He waited until they were alone in the study, with the fire built up against the October chill, before he attempted the thing he had been rehearsing, badly, for a week. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "not merely an apology. I understand now that they are not the same thing, and that you would know the difference before I said a word." "I would," Eleanor said. She sat and waited. He told her then the whole of it, his father's ruin, his mother's leaving, the doctrine he had built himself around like a scaffold and never once examined for rot. He told her about the sapphire ring he had never properly given her, kept in a drawer because giving it would have meant admitting he wanted something rather than merely required it. He stopped once, in the telling, and started again, and Eleanor let the silence sit rather than filling it for him. "I am not asking you to forgive the 2 years," he said finally. "I am telling you what they were built on, so that when I ask you to consider a different foundation, you understand I know precisely how much rebuilding that requires." "That is the explanation," Eleanor said. "I have not yet heard the apology." "I am sorry," Julian said, and it came out rougher than anything else he had said that night. "I called you suitable, in front of my own aunt, in front of a woman I let humiliate you publicly, and I did it because I had trained myself for 20 years not to notice what I was doing to the person standing closest to me. I am sorry for all of it, not for the arrangement. The arrangement gave me you, and I will not apologize for that part, whatever else I got wrong in it. I am sorry for the suitable." Eleanor considered him for a long moment. "Then here are my terms," she said, "and I would rather state them now plainly than discover in a year that we disagreed on them silently. The estate accounts remain mine to manage, in full, with my name on the ledgers where the work is mine. Larkspur Hollow remains mine, entailed to no one, held in my name for my lifetime regardless of what else changes between us. You do not arrange anything that touches my life again without asking me first, not a gathering, not a guest list, not a decision about a tenant I have built a relationship with. And you do not call me suitable again, Julian, in any room, for any reason, for the rest of our lives. Agreed, he said, without hesitation. All right, Eleanor said. All right, then, Julian said, and something in the room, some old held breath, eased very slightly, though neither of them named it. Sophia Vane came once more to Marlow Chase, in November, to make her own apology in full, not the county's version, delivered in a crowded hall, but a private one, given to Eleanor alone across the same small sitting room where she had first told the truth. I could have refused Mr. Colling from the start, she said. I chose the easier debt instead of the harder honesty. I am sorry for the part I played in your worst afternoon, and I do not ask you to forget it. I do not intend to forget it, Eleanor said. I intend to remember it precisely, and forgive it anyway, because you corrected it in the one room where the correction mattered most, at real cost to yourself. She considered the younger woman a moment. Misty, Finch tells me you have no position, now that Colling's household has scattered. Larkspur Hollow will need a steward's clerk by spring. If you have any head for figures and no objection to plain work. Sophia's composure, so carefully held through the whole visit, finally broke, not into weeping, but into something quieter, a held breath let go. Why? Because you are not the villain of this story, Eleanor said. You were a tool someone else picked up. I find I have very little use for punishing tools. I have considerably more use for good clerks. The winter that followed was, by any outward measure, unremarkable, and it was in the unremarkableness that Eleanor found the proof she had actually been waiting for. It was not in speeches. Julian made her exactly one more speech, brief and plain, the evening he finally placed the Ashford sapphire in her palm, rather than merely offering it. I am not asking you to wear this because it is expected, he said. I am asking because I would like, for once, to give you a thing rather than assign it to you. And she wore it from that night, alongside her mother's silver ring, not instead of it. But the speeches were not what convinced her. Roofs convinced her. Unwitnessed, ordinary labour, repeated on days no one was watching, convinced her. The way her mother's maxim had always insisted it should. He began moving his chair beside hers over the estate ledgers in the evenings, not across from her, and asking questions rather than issuing opinions. He began pouring her tea before she asked for it, having noticed, finally, that she took it without sugar and precisely 2 minutes steeped. He began consulting her, first on small matters and then on large ones, and, the thing that told her most, he began correcting himself aloud when he caught his own old habits reasserting themselves, rather than waiting to be caught. The relapse came in February, small and unremarkable in itself, which was exactly why it mattered. He renewed a lease on the northern farm, without consulting her first, out of nothing worse than old habit, the reflex of a man used to deciding alone, and told her of it afterward as though it were nothing. Eleanor set down her pen. That farm borders the tenant families I've spent 8 months building trust with, she said, evenly. You did not ask me. You simply did it, the way you would have a year ago. He stopped himself before defending it, which she noted, and which mattered more than the lapse itself. You're right, he said. I did exactly what I promised I would not do. I will write to the tenant tonight and amend the terms with your input included, properly, before it is finalised. I am sorry, not for the lease, for deciding it without you. That is the correction I needed to hear, Eleanor said, and let the matter close there, because she had learned by then that a single honest correction was worth considerably more than 100 promises never tested. He asked her to marry him again in March, not before a magistrate, since they were, by every legal measure, already thoroughly married, but in the walled kitchen garden where she had once taken her 10 minutes among the beanpoles, on an evening when the first real warmth of spring had finally reached Rowanbury. "You once heard me call you suitable," he said, in a room I did not know you could hear. "I have thought of little else this year but what I would say instead, if I ever had the chance to say it again, in a room you chose to be in. Say it then," Eleanor said. "You are not what I bargained for," Julian said. "I bargained for suitable. I bargained for useful and safe, and nothing that could ever cost me the way my father's choice cost him. I got, instead, a woman who rebuilt an estate I had let rot, who forgave a rival with more grace than I have ever managed toward anyone, who out-argued my own cousin in front of half the county, and did it without raising her voice once. I would choose you, Eleanor, not because it is safe. I have been choosing you, in small ways, since the day I saw your name on a ditch you had no obligation to fix, and I find I would like to spend the rest of my life choosing you in larger ones." "That is not suitable," Eleanor said. "No," Julian agreed. "It is not suitable at all." "Then we are agreed," she said. "We are agreed," he said, and this time, when he reached for her hand, she gave it to him without turning the silver ring first, because there was, for the first time in 2 years, nothing in the gesture that needed steadying. 2 years passed, and Rowanbury settled into a shape it had not held before. Larkspur Hollow, still entirely Eleanor's own, became the site of a small parish school that she and Sophia Vane, now the estate's chief clerk, and by all county accounts the sharpest head for figures Rowanbury had produced in a generation, founded together the second spring, open to tenant children regardless of what their fathers could pay. The eastern farms, long past their flooding, posted fair wages for every hand at harvest, a practice Eleanor had insisted upon the first year, and Julian had continued without being asked the second, which she took, privately, as proof of something more durable than any speech could have offered. Rupert Colling repaid Sophia's family debt within the year the magistrate had allowed him, in full, from the sale of what modest property remained to him, and left the county for a clerkship in the north that no one at Marlow Chase ever heard mentioned again. It was not forgiveness, precisely, that Eleanor felt when Finch confirmed the final payment. It was closer to completion, a ledger balanced, an account closed, nothing further owed on either side. Tam Coyle's low field, 8 harvests on from its mended drain, remained the most reliable acreage on the estate, and Tam himself sat by the second year on the small tenant council Eleanor had established to advise on exactly the kind of decisions the old Duke's arrangements had once made, without asking anyone at all. The Ashford sapphire and the plain silver ring were worn together, every day, by a duchess the county no longer discussed in whispers behind fans, but named, without irony, among the reasons Rowanbury had become a place other estates sent their agents to study. Marlow Chase itself, in the particular way houses have of holding the temperature of the marriages inside them, had stopped being cold. Guests remarked on it without quite knowing what they were remarking on, a warmth in the rooms that had nothing to do with the fires, a sense, walking the corridors, of a house finally allowed to exhale. Eleanor kept her mother's maxim, in the end, but she had changed what she heard in it. A thing well kept is not the same as a thing well loved. She had spent 2 years being the first without the second, and had answered it not with tears but with work, with ledgers, with a ditch moved 80 yards, and a forged signature caught on a single crossed 7. She had not waited to be loved before she made herself worth loving on her own account. She had simply built, patiently and in plain sight, until the man who once called her suitable had no honest word left to call her, but everything. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself impossible to unsee. And that, in the end, was not a thing that could be taken from her, not by a mistress paraded on a summer lawn, not by a forged note, not by a husband's cold arithmetic, not by anyone at all. It could only, ever, be given away, and she had learned, at last, to give it only where it was properly earned.